This podcast is brought to you by the Dunfield Retirement Residence, a casually elegant retirement community located at Yonge and Eglinton in the heart of Midtown Toronto. Customized living options complement your independent, active lifestyle. Learn more at thedunfield.com.
This is Bonjour Chai, the Sermon on the Mount Herzl edition. I'm Avi Feingold, and I'm here with Phoebe Maltz Bovy. We are your Frozen Chosen. On today's show, we have a packed episode. Phoebe has a conversation with journalist Lahav Harkov about Israel-diaspora relations in the current moment. We finally reveal the winner of this year's Sermon Slam. All this, nachas, so much more, coming right up. Phoebe, how's it going?
It's all right. How about you, Avi?
Doing all right, still in the unpacking. We're going to unpack the whole move and the unpacking in a future episode, I'm sure. But right now, I'm slowly settling in and things are okay. I have this, friend of mine who is a French Jew who keeps posting it. This hashtag has not trended. I looked, J'accuse 2023. And I realized that of all people in the world that can probably have a strong opinion or can educate us of whether this is an apt sort of hashtag in this moment, it would be Phoebe Maltz Bovy. Can you help me out with this?
Sure.
Is this something...
The moment I was born for. Yeah. So basically, J'accuse was the article in L'Aurore, I guess it was, and my pronunciation gets worse with time, but where the novelist and activist Émile Zola really got the Dreyfus Affair going. So the Dreyfus Affair was when a French Jewish army officer, Alfred Dreyfus, was falsely accused of treason. There was a Dreyfus case, but it only became the Dreyfus Affair, which split French public opinion. Really, Zola is the person largely responsible for making that happen, and with that article. So when people talk about the Dreyfus Affair, they're talking about this largely bloodless intellectual battle based on the fate of one man, that was really a battle of ideas. And I think that what's similar now is that what's happening outside of the Middle East, what's happening places like Toronto, or, elsewhere in Canada and elsewhere in North America and in Europe is, to a large extent, a battle of ideas. And it certainly has an anti-Semitism theme to it. So I think in that regard, I see parallels. I think in terms of who are the Dreyfusards and who are the anti-Dreyfusards, I think everybody thinks they're the Dreyfusards would be one way to put it. I can have my own views on this, but I do think everybody who's battling it out symbolically is convinced that they are on the side of the good people. So,
yeah, I got the sense that, there are people like this hashtag or this idea is that if you're not like Zola standing up as a non-Jew for the Jews in this case, then you're on the wrong side of history. And I'm not sure that that's a perfect comparison.
I mean, I don't think there are perfect comparisons, and I think that in general in history, and I think that's where
with reductionist hashtags.
Exactly. So I think this is where there's also all these issues with, it's their white people versus the brown people, it's this or that. It's actually Democrats versus Republicans or something. No, this is a specific thing happening in a specific place. That doesn't mean for there are people who think that if you say it's complicated, that you're excusing one or another side's violence. No, I'm saying that it's specific. I don't think you can get past the idea that it's specific. And when I see posts that are actually this is about Indigenous people in North America, and then you have Indigenous people in North America saying, no, actually this has nothing to do with us. And I think the more, I guess, if I have any kind of general thought on this that isn't sort of my own more specific politics on it, it is it's a specific issue, a specific thing happening. And it isn't bloodless or merely symbolic for Israelis or Palestinians.
All right, moving on. You probably have a take on this too.
Mm-hmm. All right, fire it at me. There have been several
articles accusing leftists of supporting rape culture because of their support for Hamas. What do you make of this?
Well, so first I'd say that I don't think all leftists support Hamas, I hope. But as for those who do, I think what you have to, here is where we do need the North American context. So basically, everybody's like, but what about Me Too, right? You know, like that's what you're hearing, right? The sort of like, aren't these people supposed to, the progressives, aren't they supposed to care about this? And yes and no. So on the one hand, yes, like about 5 minutes ago, you were seeing things online about like, is it problematic if a 35-year-old dates a 36-year-old? Is that an age gap relationship? And, you know, should we be concerned? And now suddenly it's like Hamas can go in and like rape little girls. And that's, you know, whatever, right? Like that's how it can seem sometimes to be going on parts of the left. But if you look at it a little bit differently, there was Me Too, but then there was 2020, 2021, the racial reckonings and the idea of the Karen becoming the kind of evil figure of like the sort of that like white women's tears. All of this came up a few years after Me Too and is, I think, possibly more of a reference point for the current left. And I don't think that the current left is actually presenting itself as like a women's rights advocacy group. And I would even add to that to say that you care about women's safety has become almost like a right-wing coded thing to say, because it's like, oh, does that mean you're a TERF? You know what I mean? Like it has all these other sort of connotations. So I don't find it strange. Like I find most of what's going on very strange. I am extremely surprised by historical events. I am not one of these people who's like, oh, I saw all of this coming. I did not see any of this coming. It's scary and horrible. But the specific thing of why would progressives not necessarily be all that bothered about rape? Well, I think that's just it. That has not been the big progressive preoccupation of the moment. So even if you separate out the idea that you get like, I mean, what people will say online of that sort of political bent is, but look at the death tolls, you know, among Palestinians. That's what really matters. It shouldn't matter. Like, what are a few rapes compared to, you know, that's what you'll see. But I think that, like, it's not actually surprising.
They're basically using it as this, like, bludgeon, right? It's a very blunt tool to be able to say, well, there are people raping on this side, and so therefore you should not support any of this because rape is always bad. And, you know, on the other hand, like, there's just so much happening there. I'm not justifying rape, but I'm looking at all the other atrocities. Why are you singling out this simply because you know that it's like a sensitive spot for the left, right? You should be able to go to the left and say, if you support Hamas, you're supporting murder, you're supporting torture, you're supporting terrorism, right? And it's not freedom fighting; it's terrorism in the name of, you know, something else. And using this thing is sort of this like, well, the way that did we bring it up on a past show or it was just in a meeting where like everybody likes to point out, well, if you support Hamas, they're anti, you know, LGBT. So how could you be LGBT for the left and for free Palestine if they really like crack down on gay rights in, you know, in Gaza because they're Hamas? You should be able to do that. And so it's like picking and choosing all the little things that Hamas is doing, when in reality, Hamas is doing everything wrong, right? Hamas isn't doing anything right. So why are you just pointing out the couple of things that they're doing wrong to be able to go to an interest group? Yeah.
Just to build on that, the idea that this moment is going to make Jews anti-Zionist is just the sort of hilarious to me in a way, because like I don't think it's doing that. I think there are a few anti-Zionist Jews, and I don't think they're fake Jews. I've written about this. I think they're as Jewish as the next person. I don't, whatever. I think these are like a few people who are getting a ton of media coverage at the moment because they're very symbolically interesting to people. Anti-Zionist Jews, because look, you can be Jewish and not a Zionist. Here are three people, and look at them doing that. I guess I don't think that the average sort of not particularly engaged Jew is looking at all of this and feeling like Israel is in the wrong. And I think a lot of people see, you know, accounts of like a Jewish baby having been burnt in an oven and to death and think, well, you know, I don't think that's like sending them out to go buy a keffiyeh. I don't think that's what's happening. But that's just little old me going anecdotally based on what I'm seeing in the world.
Yeah, I think you're probably right, and we can leave that one there. Opiners are going to opine as always, but that's what we do too. Let's get on with our show. Let's hear your interview with Lahav Harkov right after we hear from our sponsor.
Are you in the market for a new watch or a special piece of jewelry? Are you looking for the perfect engagement ring to pop the question? Atelier Lou has all this and more. Eric and the team at Atelier Lou can craft a piece for you, or you can select from some of the exclusive designers that they offer. From a simple bangle to a statement necklace, Atelier Lou can make you or your loved ones sparkle. Located in the heart of Westmount in Montreal or online at atelierlou.com, visit Atelier Lou for your next watch or jewelry purchase. And when you do, make sure to use promo code BON18 for 10% off your next purchase. That's atelierlou.com.
We're joined today by Lahav Harkov, who's senior political correspondent at Jewish Insider, formerly of the Jerusalem Post, and who lives in central Israel. And Lahav is a journalist I've been following for quite a long time on Twitter, or that which was formerly known as Twitter. So, Lahav, I'm going to ask you to start. How would you describe just the range of Israeli public opinion these days on everything that's going on? Because I think often in Canada, one hears a lot about a lot of people, but not necessarily Israelis.
So I think Israelis are overwhelmingly supportive of the aims of this war. The foremost being to try to get the hostages back, but also to get rid of the threat of Hamas that Israel has been living under. Hamas has been around since 1987, but they've been controlling the Gaza Strip since 2006. And have, periodically rained rockets on southern Israel and beyond for every few years, every year or two since then. So I think, there's tiny minority voices that are sort of opposed to this war to get rid of them, but it really overwhelmingly, and especially among Israeli Jews, they're very supportive of the war. Now, the politics is something else. There was a poll a couple of weeks ago that showed 86% of Israelis blame Netanyahu at some level for the failings that led to the war. So he's like a political whiz, and people have constantly said his career is over, and then somehow he's survived. So who knows? But it does seem like this is really going to be the end of the line for him. But on the left, you start hearing people who are like, we should get rid of him now. We should have an election soon, or have him be replaced with someone as soon as possible. And as you move more towards the right, you hear people say, listen, there needs to be a reckoning, but now is not the time to deal with politics. They're more willing to tolerate him, even if many of them are, unhappy with the things that were not done in the lead up to this war. And I think that political disagreement, especially in the last week or so, where you're starting to hear more and more. In the first few weeks, there was sort of a shock and mourning the losses. And so there wasn't as much politics.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I was wondering because it seems, just from what I can gather from online, but that's why we have you here to clarify a bit, there's a really big difference between the Israeli left, and I'm talking specifically about Israeli Jews on the left in Israel, and the diaspora Jewish left.
Well, I think that there's... Forgive me that I'm not entirely sure what's going on with Canadian Jews, but I see with U.S. Jews that the Jewish left is really split in some ways, that there are many people who would consider, Jewish people who would consider themselves of the left, who feel betrayed by the left, who feel that they're not being sympathetic, they're not at all sympathetic to the, massacre that took place, of the horrors, and they're not sort of reaching out to their Jewish friends to ask how they can help them, be allies, whatever other buzzwords of the left you want to use. And then you have people on the left who, are out there marching on the street with the pro-Palestinian protests. But I think that second category is much, much smaller, right? I mean, I know Canadian Jews are somewhat more politically conservative than American Jews are. But I think that, at least from what I see on the American left, the anti-Zionist Jews, they skew younger, but they're still a very small group.
Yeah, this is something that's really struck me a lot in the discourse, I suppose, this idea that, not all Jews are Zionists, and then they find the 5 truly anti-Israel Jews, who each of whom has written 10 open letters. And I don't know, like, it's
tokenism.
Yeah. I feel like they keep being brought up in context of like, well, my Jewish friends don't support Israel. It's like, it's unusual demographically.
Right. I mean, absolutely. Like, again, sorry to bring up the America all the time, but you look at, like, say, Bernie Sanders, who is someone who you would think would be all in with these pro-Palestinian marches just because who his usual political allies are. And yet he said in an interview recently that, like, a ceasefire would be a reward for Hamas, that they just use it to regroup and attack Israel again, which is something that you hear from, most Jews I talk to these days. So it really is just like this small sort of token group. And there's a lot of overlapping membership in the 3 or 4 organizations that organize all these protests.
Yeah, that does seem to be my hunch. And I guess like now I get to be a Bernie bro after all this time. But yeah, so I guess I'm wondering what did Hamas think it was doing? Like what was the point of this apart from being like a nightmare scenario that keeps the mothers of all Jewish children up at night?
I think Hamas knew exactly what it was doing, to be honest. I think it knew what the result would be, maybe not the extent of it, but there's an article in the New York Times today, which I thought was, I mean, it's like sort of strange to call it a good article because it was horrifying to read, but they spoke to senior Hamas members and about sort of what they were thinking and what are they thinking going forward. And they said that, first of all, their intention was to sort of put the Palestinian cause on the map again. They felt like the Middle East forgot about the Palestinians and they wanted them to pay attention. They definitely succeeded on that front. And then they knew that Israel was going to strike back harder than it had in the past because they knew that they were attacking Israel much worse than in the past. And then you see all these interviews that are on social media now that are being translated mostly by Memory, which is an organization that like watches Middle East and Arabic media and translates it. That senior members of Hamas are saying things like, we'll just do October 7th again and again and again as much as we need to. So I think they knew what was going to happen, and they don't have that much regard for civilian life, including Palestinian civilian life.
Were you surprised by global reactions and how sort of sympathetic many around the world seem to be to Hamas, I suppose would be? I don't think, and I'll get into this in a moment, I don't think everybody who says that they're for a ceasefire is sympathetic to Hamas. I think people have different reasons for saying the things they say, but I mean, yeah, it seems like there's been a bit more pro-Hamas sentiment than I would have expected given the nature of the crimes. I mean, really.
I guess I was surprised by it in North America. I wasn't so surprised by it in Europe, nor in Great Britain. A lot of the like phenomena that we see on college campuses in North America, the like anti-Israel things, and that have gotten more extreme in recent years. They were like that in the UK like 10 years ago. I have a friend who his job in life basically is to be like a pro-Israel speaker. He goes around on college campuses and gives all these speeches. And I think it was 10 years ago, maybe it was 8 years ago, where he was like barricaded in a room because there were anti-Israel people trying to attack the event that he was holding. So, you're seeing that now on American campuses. Unfortunately, it's terrifying. But I was much less surprised in Europe. But the extent of it in the United States, in New York, on all of these college campuses, and maybe the thing that shocked me the most is people chanting glory to the martyrs. You have just like a bunch of like white 20-year-old girls chanting glory to the martyrs. And you're like, do you understand what you mean? Like you're joining a death cult, basically.
Yeah. It's been strange. And because I researched French Jews. That was what I did like my PhD on. So the French aspect, European aspect of this, it just seems more like the US is to some extent, and Canada also to some extent, kind of becoming more like Europe. But I guess one thing I was wondering, I think the typical North American, like Gen Z or millennial who calls for a ceasefire is kind of responding on some level to this idea that October 7th was Israel's 9/11, and which it was called at the time, and is kind of transposing the current situation in Israel and in Gaza onto the Iraq war, and basically saying that they don't want Israel to do what the U.S. did after 9/11 because it didn't necessarily help matters. And it didn't, I see this and I think that this isn't exactly analogous, but do you think that that's some of what's happening? And if so, how would you perhaps compare these two situations?
I mean, I agree with you. I don't think it's analogous. I also think, if anything, it would be more like Afghanistan than Iraq, right? Which
well, sure,
right, because I mean, Iraq was started on false pretenses, and we could all argue over whose fault the false pretenses were, but but Afghanistan had a more sort of direct, clear connection in a way. But the Taliban attacked the U.S. once, and Hamas it has been attacking Israel every few years, and then this was just much worse than ever before. Like, Israel kept saying, "Okay, we can take this. We're going to try to deter them a bit, and then we're going to go back to our regular lives, and we can handle it." And for the people who live near Gaza, who live in the Western Negev, it was horrible and traumatizing. But for most of Israel, they barely felt it, right? And now on October 7th, it was just an attack that was so big that suddenly everyone realized that this idea of deterrence, and that we just have to sort of re-up the deterrence every couple of years, obviously failed. So I do think it's very different. I also think that Americans, and maybe the West in general, they don't realize that sometimes you can have a war that is just a short war and you win. But that's been most of Israel's experience, right? When Israel goes to war, it's usually a month, a couple months. In one case, it was 6 days. And then you have a new situation. And that's not to say that that's what's going to happen now. I don't know what's going to happen now, but not every war is Vietnam or Iraq.
I mean, I think that is a lot of what I'm seeing. Just seems to be what somebody on Twitter, I think, called America brain, that something was very America brained. And I found that a good expression, because I feel like that's a lot of it. And that's actually kind of my next question, which is that what seems to have also happened in the North American discourse specifically is this idea that this is really about white people versus racialized people, and that's really who's fighting here. And it sometimes seems like, on the one hand, it seems like kind of you could just point to the demographics of Israel and be like, what are you talking about? But but then I've also seen, unfortunately, on the right, sort of far right, some people who are saying, go Israel, go white people, you know what I mean? In this kind of bizarre way. It's like, do you know the demographics? But I guess I'm just wondering what you would say people should, in North America, particularly perhaps some of the younger ones, should know, who are interpreting this conflict as basically like North American racial politics.
I mean, as you were referring to, it's entirely different. I mean, the two things are not really analogous at all. In a sense, you have, I mean, you can't really compare the Jewish return to the land of Israel to anything else in history, because it's basically unique. I mean, someone might be able to find some other obscure similar example, but there aren't many cases of an indigenous population being forced out of its land and then returning to it 2,000 years later, right? I can't think of anyone else. And so, to begin with, that's very different from, slaves being brought across the ocean as slaves. And I mean, the entire situation is different. We can go century by century or decade by decade of history. And then there's the whole demographics thing, like you said. I mean, Israelis are very, very diverse. Certainly, if you're going to narrow things down to color or to the origin of people's, grandparents. Most Israeli Jews are what are called Mizrahi Jews, which are from North Africa or the Middle East, which, most of these people would not consider, I think, North African and Middle Eastern people to be white. They would consider them people of color. And so that sort of makes them the same as the Palestinians in that sense. I think that people who are a little bit smarter about it and maybe a little bit more academic about it would be talking more about power imbalances, which, brings you to sort of the whole academic theories that have become so dominant on campuses, right? Where it's not necessarily the color right? It just has to do with who has more power. But, the weaker person is not always the right person. And I don't, is Hamas, you get into these murky questions where, well, a 9-month-old baby, he's stronger than the Hamas terrorists who kidnapped him.
Yeah, it's, I don't even know where to begin. Something that really just does strike me is a lot of people who are sort of arguing about this online seem to think that they're kind of going to relitigate 1948. It seems to be very much more about 1948 than 1967. And it seems to be very much this idea that if you had the best argument online, that you could somehow, that you would have had a different idea than than starting a modern Jewish nation state in that location. And what seems to be missing, I don't know, like whether you've seen this also, but just sort of this idea of Israel as an actual place that does exist and that's not like currently being suggested as something to maybe put there. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know if I'm explaining this right, but.
No, but there are definitely some nuggets in there that I think are good to discuss. I mean, first of all, I think for liberal people in general, or people on the moderate left, right? The question is 1967, right? Generally, people in the center to left think that there should be a two-state solution. But people further to the left have maybe been more subtle about it, but have often thought that Israel is, they say it's a colonialist, settler colonial entity, etc., which is also absurd for many reasons. And so I think that like the mask has come off in a lot of ways because, when people say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, there's no, from the river to the sea are the places where the two-state solution is supposed to be. So if the whole place is going to be free Palestine, whatever free Palestine means, then you don't have a two-state solution. Then you are relitigating 1948, like the very establishment of the state of Israel. So I think you're really right about that.
One thing, though, I was going to ask, and this is going to be more of a tough question, perhaps, because there was a travel warning for Israelis that I watched the video of this that included a warning that Israelis who are abroad should not be sort of open about being Israeli or Jewish because of all the anti-Semitism in the diaspora.
Yeah, the National Security Council put this travel warning.
Right. So I guess what I'm wondering is just how one squares this with the fact that while there have been, and I don't want to diminish them, isolated incidents of anti-Jewish violence in the diaspora since October 7th, and obviously before October 7th, as well as plenty of, graffiti and goodness knows how many social media posts, it's difficult at this moment to make the case that Israel is the world's safest place physically for Jews. So I guess I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
Look, I know people who left Israel since the war started, like people who have family outside of Israel, may have been recent immigrants. And so I'm not saying that I don't think they left for good, but they were like, we don't want to be here right now. And I also know people who were outside of Israel and came back and said they feel safer in a place that Jews are running the show and there's a Jewish army. So I think, for a lot of people it's subjective, but in terms of the travel warning, I think a lot has to do with being visibly Jewish and visibly Israeli. Israelis are not known to use their indoor voices. And if you're speaking very loud in Hebrew, someone might recognize it. You might be wearing a t-shirt or carrying a tote bag that has Hebrew on it. And then you could be a target if you're in some sort of big city where there's been these anti-Israel protests. I mean, there's a lot of harassment going on that we've certainly, you could see online in endless videos. So, and violent incidents, even if they're not so many, thank God, at this point. And the threat level is very high, right? Like there's been a jump. The FBI has said that it's like record highs of threats. So I think that they're referring to all of that. They're telling people to be cautious.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, my feeling here is sort of, I want to be like, everybody should just shout that they're Jewish from the rooftops, even if they're not Jewish. That's kind of my, then I did say that. And now I feel like people keep forwarding me people who aren't Jewish who are doing this, but they seem to constantly do it with this big, I'm not Jewish, but, and I feel like that kind of may defeat the purpose. But
it's like this, I am Spartacus.
Yes,
moment.
that's exactly. Because I mean, if it takes some heart in the fact that I've heard people speaking Hebrew loudly in Toronto and wearing stuff with Hebrew on it. And it has been, and like, since October 7th. I mean, and I think so far, at least as I've been walking around, like, children in the aquarium were wearing shirts with Hebrew and they seemed fine and they were just having a nice time. But I guess I worry sometimes that there's too much emphasis. I don't know. I feel like there needs to be a certain amount of, like, Jews exist, Jews are going to keep existing. And I don't even know how to explain this.
I agree. Like, you shouldn't have to be embarrassed in any way to be Jewish. You should be able to walk around, and proudly declare that you're Jewish and wear whatever you want, even if it shows that you're Jewish or Israeli. I think, unfortunately, since 2014, more or less, whenever Hamas attacks Israel, it becomes like a more tense time for diaspora Jews.
Yeah, for sure. So just one more question, though, that I wanted to ask you, because you wrote about this and I found it really interesting what you wrote, which is just about sort of how people who are not in Israel can stay informed and know. I don't mean in terms of, like, all of the misinformation, but just specifically, like, you wrote about a man who'd been posing as an IDF spokesman but isn't. So what was going on there and how did that turn out?
So there's this guy. He denies that he's a Messianic Jew, but he's a Jewish person who believes in Jesus. So you could take that however you want. His name is Hanania Naftali. And he grew up in Israel. I don't know if he was, I think he's too young to have been born in the Soviet Union. So I think his parents came to Israel from the Soviet Union. I'm not entirely sure. And he grew up in Israel. He went to the army. I'm not sure when exactly he found Jesus, but he, after the army, started basically making pro-Israel social media content. And he was doing this, like, freelance, like it was his own thing, and he grew in popularity. He basically became like a pro-Israel social media influencer. Someone in Netanyahu's office several years ago saw this, liked his videos, brought him on to help with Netanyahu's social media content. And he had been working sort of as a contractor for the Likud party, basically, but he was making videos for Netanyahu. He wasn't really making, like, Likud political things. In any case, and he seemed to have been doing work for Netanyahu as recently as the beginning of this year. But again, it was like freelance. He's not like a full-time Netanyahu employee. And when the war started, as far as I can tell, and nobody has, and I've confirmed this with various people who work for Netanyahu and Likud, he has not been doing any communications relating to the war. And also his personal social media stuff is not Netanyahu's stuff, right? Like, he was helping Netanyahu produce content. Anyway, he let it seem like he, like, implied without saying exactly that he was working for Netanyahu, and he recorded videos wearing, like, the uniforms that reservists wear, which I don't even know what it's called in English, but it's, like, not the dress uniform, the more casual uniform, and that's what reservists wear in Israel. And he even recorded a video like that. He even did a TV interview wearing the uniform, which is actually against the law, if you're not authorized by the army to do so. And he made a lot of mistakes. I mean, he used, like, footage from the Syrian civil war and called it Israel. He, like, used AI to, like, spruce up some photos. So, like, the photos weren't totally fake, but they looked really fake because he used AI to make them look better, like less blurry and whatever. And he made all kinds of mistakes when there was the explosion next to the Al-Ali hospital in Gaza that at first people, like, misreported that Israel had bombed it and that hundreds of people have died. And in the end, neither of those things are true. But he, in the immediate aftermath, wrote, like, yes, Israel bombed this hospital, but Hamas hides under hospitals, which was incredibly damaging. And people were quoting him as a government spokesman. So I did some digging, and as I mentioned, he's not working for Netanyahu these days. He's not serving as the IDF spokesman. He's just making it look that way. And then he has, a link to his Patreon pinned to the top of his Twitter page.
Are there? Yeah. So I was wondering, just one final question. Sorry, I realized that it popped into my head as we're chatting, which is just, do you think that this moment is going to bring diaspora and Israeli Jews closer together, further apart, or some other possibility?
I think that it's already bringing diaspora Jews in Israel closer together, because I think a lot of people who didn't think they cared that much about Israel now care about what's happening, for starters. And I think that diaspora Jews, again, who were not like following what's going on in Israel as closely, like maybe has a little bit more of an understanding of Israel's challenges now. So in that way, it can bring them closer. I think there's something unfortunate, though, that I would like there to be like a positive connection to Israel. Israel is like I think it's a great place to live and a great place to visit and an interesting history. And like, it would be nice to have connections based on positive things and not only on, this sort of fear that the Jewish safe haven is not safe, or, sympathy for the victims of an attack. But I guess we'll start here and try to build something positive going forward.
Well, fair enough. Thank you so much for joining us on Bonjour Chai.
Thanks for having me.
When Jewish families in the GTA are struggling, workers at Jewish Family and Child Service are there. These workers make sure every Jewish child has a safe home. They support Holocaust survivors living in poverty. They ensure no elderly members of our community are isolated. They provide grief counseling, offer financial support for impoverished families, and help Jewish children go to camp. But they make, on average, $10,000 a year less than their counterparts at other agencies. Their employer has threatened to lock them out, right as the Jewish community faces a growing crisis of anti-Semitism. To make sure Jewish families can count on help when they need it, we need to take care of these workers. Right now, more than 100 workers at Jewish Family and Child Service are fighting to ensure their employer invests in them and in the Jewish community. Go to cupe.ca/JFCS to learn more and send a message of support.
So, this moment has been both long in the making, and we've been waiting to announce it for quite a while, too. Our original plan was to announce the winner of the Great Canadian Sermon Slam right after all of the holidays, in time for Shabbat Bereshit, when we start the cycle of Torah reading again. But then the terrible tragedy of Simchat Torah and its aftermath happened, and we thought it best to wait a bit while the world found its bearings again. We are far from being on sure footing as a community, but we couldn't wait any longer, and we also thought this would be a good way for people to break out of the endless doom scrolling that is a feature of our lives. And so without further ado, I would love to introduce the winner of 5784's Great Canadian Sermon Slam, Rabbi Lisa Grishkow. Rabbi Grishkow is the senior rabbi of Temple Emmanuel Beth Shalom in Montreal, and while I consider her a good friend, I can assure you this in no way affected the judging of her sermon. Rabbi Lisa, welcome to Bonjour Chai.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here.
So, when we talk about the Sermon Slam this year, last year, we talk about how we judge sermons on their ability to teach something new, how they give a chidush in some way, their relevance to contemporary life, as well as how engaging they are, a bit of the entertainment factor. How do these factors come into play whenever you write an average sermon on Shabbat or for the holidays?
Well, those are very different things, of course, right? How one approaches a sermon, at least how I do, on a weekly basis versus the high holidays, which is really a much more intense, immersive kind of process. But at the end of the day, I try to write the kind of sermon that I'd like to hear, right? And so it has to be human. It has to include stories. It's got to be grounded in Torah and text. But I'm a huge fan of the midrashic technique of the Petechta, of just starting out way in left field and catching people's attention and having them wonder how on earth we're going to come to the themes of the text or the themes of the day. But that's really it. I try and write the kind of sermons that would keep me awake.
Yeah, I find that I've heard that from rabbis also, that they get often bored of themselves or bored of other people. And so if they can keep themselves entertained, that's always an important piece for that. What's your process for writing a sermon generally? Do you have like a weekly routine that you do? Do you have like a style of doing things where you say, by Monday I have to be thinking about this, by Wednesday I have to be doing that, I have to memorize it by a certain point, I have to keep it written? What do you do?
Not many of those things.
Okay.
I think on a weekly basis, it's percolating. It's percolating all week, right? And as congregational rabbis, we have the privilege of and responsibility of being part of people's life cycle events. So by the time it comes to Shabbat, the parsha may be something that we've already engaged with, right? Or that I've engaged with in a baby naming or a bris or in preparing for a bar mitzvah or, God forbid, a funeral. So there are different encounters with the parsha over the course of the week. There are different commentaries that I go to, different things that I might be reading or thinking about. And so it all is just percolating on a weekly basis until it comes closer to Shabbat. When it comes to high holidays, it's completely different. I really take the summer to read very widely and deeply, and to start saving things, taking notes, putting things together, percolating there too. But it just is a longer process. I sometimes say that I start thinking about the next high holidays the day after Yom Kippur is done.
You don't even take off Cheshvan for that time, right? The proverbial rabbi's heart Cheshvan.
Yeah, well, it certainly hasn't been that kind of Cheshvan this year, right?
That is correct. Can you walk us through this year's sermon, AI, Avraham Avinu? What led you to doing this, to thinking about it, and why now, why this?
It's a good question, and it really does feel like a lifetime ago at this point, right? Because so much has happened.
It really does, yeah.
Since then. And it's a funny thing with high holiday sermons. I find that so much thought goes into them, but once they're behind us, and we're on to the next thing. And it's sometimes not until we hear back from people, sometimes years later, that we know that something has really had an impact or hit home beyond the moment of delivery. But with this one,
yeah,
I didn't feel equipped to give a sermon about AI per se, but I was really interested in this notion of confirming one's humanity, right? I thought that was a great phrase, not I am not a robot, but positively to confirm one's humanity. And I've been thinking about how, as we've been emerging from COVID, which is ironic to say since I currently have COVID myself, but as we've been emerging on a societal level in the synagogues, right, we're rediscovering these points of contact and these questions of what makes us human? What do we need? What can we offer one another as individuals, and how precious that is? And I think there was a lot of talk during COVID of how we are going to, reevaluate our connection to community, to work, to life, to time. And those things slip out of our hands very quickly when we're not forced to look at them. But I think the great gift of the high holidays is it gives us the opportunity to look at the things that matter. And I think that's one of the responsibilities we have as rabbis, is to try and draw our own attention and our community's attention to the things that matter.
You mentioned the events of the past month has been really a moment of upheaval. I want to be able to turn to that just for a minute. Rabbis are often under tremendous strain in general and juggle so much now more than ever, especially in times of crisis. As recently as this week, there was a shul in your community that had an attempted firebombing in Montreal and Dollar des Ormeaux. How are some of the ways that people turn to their rabbinic leaders in times like this?
And since we're talking about sermons, I would say the sermon is really just the tip of the iceberg, right?
For sure, yeah.
Because it's one forum that we have, but so much of what we do is one-on-one, or it's in small groups, in conversations. And I think especially with something like what's happening now, you're right. I think all of us as human beings, all of us as Jews, and those of us who are rabbis, are being pulled in many different directions. There's the outward call to be in solidarity with Israel, to see how we can help, what we can do in the face of something that has been absolutely horrific and has affected our friends and family in countless ways and continues to, right? One of the first things I do when I get up in the morning is check on our Israeli families WhatsApp group. They're in Rishon LeZion. They've been hit by bombs, by rockets every day. So there's the Israel-oriented piece of it. And then there's the question of how do we help comfort and strengthen our community internally when we're seeing a lot of ugliness of anti-Semitism rearing its head? How do we help people who are trying to live their own commitments and their own values and are scared and don't know a way forward, right? All of us are navigating pretty uncharted territory. And so there are many elements, obviously, to what we're doing right now. And then on top of that, there's, media requests and interviews and statements. And those things in some ways are not so important, but in other ways are important because it's important that our community has a voice and that there are many voices that are heard within our community, and many perspectives, and that we continue to humanize the face of what's happening. So there really are many, many levels. I could probably say it more articulately, but when you're in it, it's hard to step back from it.
For sure. One of the ways that I know you is as an outspoken advocate for peace. You know, you've spoken in the past at rallies for democracy in Israel. You've had Palestinian advocates for peace speak at your congregation. In a time like this, how do we bridge this divide that seems to be growing within the Jewish community that is as polarized as we can possibly be? And how do you maintain a stance of wanting a truly just and lasting peace in the Middle East at the same time?
That's not a small question, my friend.
Absolutely not.
I think in some ways the Jewish community is quite united right now. And I'm hearing the same from Israeli society. There are people who agree on absolutely nothing except that they're trying to support each other in the response to October 7th, right? And so there is a strong and powerful sense of unity. I sometimes wish it didn't take tragedy to give us that sense, but it's better to have it than not to have it, right? I think along with most Israelis, most Jews who are on the progressive end of the spectrum are feeling like now is not the time that we are going to figure out how we move forward in terms of the politics of Israel, of Palestinians. Right now, it's much more existential. Not that the other isn't existential, but this is urgently existential, right? That Israel is facing significant threats, that there's this ongoing heartbreak of the hostages being held in Gaza and not knowing what's happening to them. And so the focus right now has to be, I think, on supporting Israel's very existence. And only then do I think we have the opportunity to take a breath and to say, how on earth do we move forward from this? How on earth do we hold on to the hope of coexistence? And I think the challenge for many of us, myself included, is that we don't have any more faith or confidence in the Netanyahu government than we did a month ago. I worry a lot about the direction all of this is going, but I also know, first of all, that I don't know even what I don't know. I'm not a geopolitical strategist. I'm not a politician. I am not going to opine on things that I know nothing about, which, by the way, I think is one of the important things for rabbis and sermons, right? Like, stay in your lane. We're not op-ed columnists. We're not scientists. We're not politicians. It's got to be rooted in Torah and in Jewish values and Jewish life if what we say is to have any legitimacy or authenticity or meaning. So I know what I don't know. And I know that this is an impossible situation, right? Nobody wants a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. I mean, maybe Hamas does, but nobody else I know wants that. It's awful. And at the same time, you can't have Hamas as a neighbor. You can't have a repeat of October 7th. And so those are really tough questions that I think we're all going to have to grapple with. And one of the things I spoke about just a week ago, I think it was, is how we're still really in a period of mourning. We're just at the end of Shloshim after October 7th. And when you're in mourning, you shouldn't have to issue statements. You shouldn't have to come up with strategies. You have to just be able to mourn. And after that, I think whenever and whatever that looks like is when we have to figure out, how do we as a Jewish community here in Montreal figure out our response? How does Israel find a way to move forward with hopes of democracy and coexistence and ultimately peace? Because that can't be out of reach, right? As Jews, we always pray for peace, even when it seems totally improbable and implausible. We don't let go of that, just like we didn't let go of the dream of returning to Israel after thousands of years. And I think societally also, here in Galut, here in diaspora, we have to figure out what this looks like. How do we, especially in Montreal, which has a large Jewish community and a large Muslim community, how do we keep from falling into patterns of us and them? How do we not import the conflict that's going on across the ocean into our streets and into our schools, right? How do we remember that we are here living in a liberal democracy and there are rules of engagement in terms of how we talk about each other and how we treat each other? And those are not easy conversations to have ever. They're certainly not easy conversations to have right now. But I remember Dr. Victor Goldblum, Alav Shalom, writing in his book, Building Bridges, essentially that if we can't find ways to talk to each other here, how on earth can we expect people to find ways to talk to each other there? So I have been kind of keeping those lines of communication open, and we have heard from Christian colleagues and friends, and we have heard from Muslim colleagues and friends. But it is not the easiest time for building bridges right now. And I think when we're on the other side of this, we're going to have to figure out which bridges can be rebuilt and which bridges really have been burned in this.
Is there any Torah that's grounding you these days that you would want to share with everybody?
It's such a hard question. And it's such an important question, right? And the fact is, we're privileged. We've got so many great colleagues. There's so much good and important Torah being spoken right now. So it's Rabbi Eliana Yolkut, my colleague, who wrote about the fact that we're mourning so much right now. And that connected me to thinking about Shiva and thinking about Shoshim and Jewish wisdom on mourning, because our text, of course, is our traditions as well. It's not just the text of the Torah or Talmud. So that's been grounding for me right now. Rabbi Daniel Berg down in Baltimore wrote something really powerful a few weeks ago about the tension between universalism and particularism. That we progressive Jews tend to lean towards universalism, but we're feeling our particularism very strongly right now, and remembering that there's real legitimacy to, the fact that you and I, we love our own kids more than other people's kids, even though we care about those kids as well, that there is this sense of family and closeness and connection and tribe. That's not a bad thing. It's a very human thing. It activates our empathy and our sense of connection. And there are so many Jewish texts on that, especially as we're in Bereshit, as we're in Genesis. And sometimes it hits too close to home, right? You read about Lot being taken captive. That doesn't feel far away right now. And it makes you realize, and there's a bitter comfort in this, that as a people, we have, unfortunately, a whole lot of experience in being taken captive. And
let's not forget that in the same moment that's happening, Avraham is fighting with God to avoid a humanitarian crisis by saying, why would you kill people if there are a certain amount of innocent people there? And he really is trying to say, maybe we shouldn't go and, create these major crises. But sometimes sometimes he loses, and sometimes those are necessary. Absolutely.
And he loses. Though I'll tell you one thing I learned years ago, that when thinking about that text that blew me away when I first learned it, we talk about the daily tefillot, the daily prayers being connected to the patriarchs, right? So Avraham is shacharit, he's the morning prayer because he gets up early in the morning, and Yitzchak is mincha because he's wandering in the fields in the afternoon. When he sees Rebecca, he's meditating, and Yaakov is connected with Mariv with the evening prayer because he has all of his dreams and experiences and connections with God at night. And I had always assumed that Avraham being connected with the morning was when he gets up early for the Akedah, for the binding of Isaac. But it's not. The proof text is taken from when he wakes up early to check on what's happened with Sodom and Gomorrah. And he sees that his call for justice to God has not been answered, or has been answered, but not in the way that he hoped, and that the cities have been wiped out. And so it's absolutely a moment of devastation and disillusionment. And he prays. He gets up early. He doesn't disengage. He goes to see what's happened, and he still finds a way to talk to God. And that, I think, is really powerful. Mm-hmm. Really, really powerful. That we don't just show up or speak up when things are easy.
Sure.
Right? We do it especially when things are hard. And that's for others, and that's for God, perhaps, and that's for us.
Jonathan Sachs always likes to point out that God answers all of our prayers. Sometimes just the answer is no. But that's important, absolutely. But that doesn't give us the absolution to stop praying and stop asking.
No, and remember also that the heart of Shiva is you show up.
Absolutely.
Right? And Jewish funerals aren't about theology. They're about presence.
Absolutely.
And that's important right now.
All right. Well, Rabbi Lisa Grishkow, thank you so much. Mazel tov again. It's a well-earned win. I really hope you get to display the Kiddush Cup and use it and over the course of this year. I know that you have a well-earned sabbatical coming up soon, so rest up, refuah shlema on your COVID, and mazel tov again. I cannot wait for you to join the panel of judges for next year's Sermon Slam as well.
It will be an honor and a pleasure.
Thank you. We're back. Let's get to our nachas. Phoebe, what's your nachas this week?
Well, mine is going to be the Bata Shoe Museum in Toronto.
Ooh, I like that.
I went there on, I don't remember whichever day it was, that my daughter's daycare was closed because the city had shut the water. So exciting stuff there. but you can try on. So there's more specifically, well, it's two things about the Bata Shoe Museum, okay? One is that I did not realize this, but there's some exhibit where you can like try on shoes, do dress up there.
Oh,
and
okay.
It's really, really fun. A lot of it is like, you know, size whatever, 11, size 13 giant stiletto heels. So that was not something I wear every day. And also like there are children's shoes. There are shoes that look like fish that you can put on. It's very exciting. But they also have a new special exhibit where they've turned part of the museum into what looks like a 1980s mall, like a set.
I saw the signs for that when I was in Toronto last week because I was
really
staying
cool.
2 blocks away, and I didn't end up going in, and now you're making me regret that. To add, well, before I get to mine, to add to what you just did, if you're a fan of clothing and thinking about clothing, there's this amazing podcast called Articles of Interest where they take clothing and the different article or different idea about clothes every episode and talk about it in a real deep way. And they just did a live episode from the Bata Shoe Museum with really getting into some various shoes that they had there, which was really, really cool. So I highly recommend you go check that out. My nachas, though, is for a piece that I did not end up discussing with Rabbi Lisa Grishko, but people don't know that she is the official Jewish advisor for Canada Post, which is kind of cool, if you ask me. And they need a consultant on all these, you know, various religions because sometimes they have gaffes. Like apparently in 2017, their Hanukkah stamp had a big yellow star, which was kind of a no-no on there. You know, they thought it was cool to have a Magen David there, but a big yellow one, it just wasn't good. So she advised this year's Hanukkah stamp. We will put a link to it in the show notes. There's a magazine article about it in the CJN magazine coming out.
I was about to say, I think I just copy edited something on
if
this very topic.
If you donate now, you will get the magazine in time to delivery for this Hanukkah episode, this Hanukkah issue, this issue which is much more than just Hanukkah, but has a whole story about this great Canadian Hanukkah stamp that Rabbi Grishko advised on, and go check it out. It's really cool. If you're a philatelist or even philatelically inclined, you might be interested by that.
Sounds really cool.
Yeah. I think that's about it. That was a great show. I do want to mention that we have a bunch of subscribers already for our Substack, which is starting next week, I believe. So go to bonjourchai.substack.com, and I believe that we're really getting into the full swing of it in the coming week or two. And there will be an extension of the pod. There'll be news, ideas, things that don't quite make it into the pod. Yeah, Phoebe, are you excited about this?
I am excited about it. I do have a Substack. I think this one will be quite different from mine, but that I'll be involved in it also.
Excellent.
I'm involved in 2 Substacks already, so this will be the third one. I'm just gonna be a finger in every Substack, as it were.
Thank you for listening to Bonjour Chai for the week ending November 11th, Shabbat Parashat Chayei Sarah and Remembrance Day. The show is produced and edited by Zach Kaufman. The executive producer for CGN Podcast is Michael Freeman. Our music is by So-Called. We are a project of the Jewish Living Lab and are distributed by the CJN Podcast Network. You can listen to all our past episodes on our page at thecjn.ca/bonjour, and you can subscribe to the podcast and automatically receive all episodes on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love it if you told a friend about Bonjour Chai. It is always one of the best ways we get new listeners. And as always, you can email us with comments at bonjour@thecjn.ca.
The Dunfield Retirement Residence offers customized living options to complement your independent, active lifestyle. Welcome home. Welcome to the Dunfield. Visit us at thedunfield.com to book a personal tour.